Hello and welcome to today's spontaneous video. Hi, my name is Maddie and welcome back to my channel, or thanks for joining us if you're new here. Today I'm gonna be doing something a little bit different. Yeah, so I'm hoping it's not gonna get too serious, but either way my webcomic Wednesday for tomorrow is very chaotic, so I feel like that'll help balance out this video if that happens. But for those of you who don't know, today is April 6th and it is the first International Asexuality Day, which is super exciting. So I'm gonna I'll talk about myself, then I'll give us a little crash course, and then I'll dive into what this video is going to be about, which is what it's like being asexual and being a reader. So to talk about myself a little bit, I identify as asexual demi-romantic. So that basically means that I don't feel sexual attraction to anyone, regardless of gender. And I'm using the term demi-romantic right now because that's kind of what I feel comfortable with, but I'm still sorting out my aerospec identity. Basically, it's very difficult for me to feel romantic attraction towards someone, and I need to be friends with them for a really long time and have a strong emotional relationship before I'm able to move those feelings beyond. That's the label that I'm comfortable with, but like I said, we're still sorting that out. The asexual one I'm pretty solid with. I feel like that's something that I make jokes about on this channel, but I don't know how openly I've ever addressed it, and honestly, I'm tired of hiding it. I didn't know this was gonna get this emotional. It's really hard for me because I think I'm always worried about who's going to see these videos, what the impact's going to be, and because of that I feel like sometimes I'm holding a piece of myself back, and that's really hard for me to come and sit in front of a camera and talk and feel like I'm not being authentic. So I think it's really important for me to have open conversations because, like, obviously my orientation is not everything about myself, but it does impact the way that I see the world, and especially in a world that really values sexual and romantic relationships. For those of you who don't know the terminology or anything and are super confused about what I'm talking about, let me give you a little crash course, and then I'm going to link lots of resources down below if you want to learn more. The split attraction model, let's start there. So the split attraction model is essentially looking at romantic and sexual orientation as two different things. That one is being like romantically attracted to people, one is being sexually attracted to people, and for a lot of people those things overlap. So a lot of times when someone's like, oh, I'm straight, it usually means that they are sexually attracted to people of the opposite gender, and they are also often romantically attracted to the people of the other gender as well. However, for some people, it's a lot easier to look at those as two different feelings. So for some people might be bisexual, which means that they're attracted to people of two or more genders, but they might be aromantic, which means that they don't have romantic feelings for those people despite the fact that they would be sexually attracted to them. And it's just a way of kind of looking at and understanding sexual and romantic orientation and kind of breaking it down. The other word that I might throw around in this episode is amanormativity, which is a term that was coined, I believe Blake is the last name of the person who coined it, and it deals with this idea that in our society we really value relationships, specifically romantic and sexual relationships, and so much of our society is centered around ideas of needing to be in a marriage, be romantically and sexually involved with someone in order to be fulfilled, and that's not really true. So we live in a society that focuses on that. It focuses on monogamous relationships, which are relationships with only one people, and then of course we also exist in a heteronormative society that focuses on relationships between cisgendered men and women, and then our society also values cisgender people too. So very confusing. I feel like I'm throwing so much information at you. I'm so sorry if none of this makes any sense. But let's talk asexuality, because that's what this video is supposed to be about. Asexuality essentially means that you don't feel any sexual attraction for somebody else. That doesn't mean that my body doesn't work properly. I can still feel things, all the parts are there, they all do what they're supposed to. I just don't have that desire to be, I've never looked at someone and been like, oh, they're hot. Growing up, everyone I knew had celebrity crushes and talked about how attractive people were, and I was like, that means nothing to me. That's just a person. I can be like, yeah, they're kind of pretty, but I don't understand that gut arousal reaction that people have in some of those scenarios. And some people might feel that, some people don't, because asexuality is a spectrum, and there's all sorts of different identities underneath that. So some other terms are demisexual, which means you need to have a strong emotional or romantic connection to the person in order to be sexually attracted to them. There's also gray asexual, which it just kind of means like those feelings kind of come and go, or they're a little bit there sometimes, not there other times. It's kind of a broader term that can be used, and there's lots of other terms that people like to use as well, so feel free to do some more research on that. But the important thing is to know that like asexual people can still have sex, they still have all those parts, they all work, and some asexual people do choose to have sex, whether that's because it's like pleasurable for their partner and that's something that they recognize that their partner needs for them to be in a relationship, or if they're choosing to engage in sexual activity solo because that's something that brings them pleasure. That's totally up to individual people. There's also other terms that are often used in the ace community, which are sex repulsed, sex neutral, and sex favorable. Sex repulsed are people who are like, ew, gross, don't really like sex, no interest in being involved in that. Sex neutral is kind of like, like I don't really care, I don't really have much of an opinion on it. Sex favorable is like, yeah, I'm not opposed to doing those things, they're just not like the top of priority for me. Cake is this huge thing in the asexual community because it's essentially like, if I had the choice between having sex and having cake, I would probably go and have cake instead. That was my little crash course lesson. Sorry, I'm so wrapped up in like studying and being around this stuff a lot that I find it hard sometimes to be like, okay, the basics, just the basics. So I hope that's helpful. If anyone has questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I will do my best to answer, but I am in no way an expert, and everything that I'm sharing in this video is going to be from my own personal experience. Let's talk books. Romance. So I think it's important to recognize that asexuality has to deal with the sexual attraction, and then there's also a term that's aromantic for people who don't feel romantic attraction. And because I identify as demi-romantic, I'm someone who identifies as arospec, so I'm like on that spectrum of aromanticism. I struggle with the fact that so many books focus heavily on relationships and don't necessarily value friendships in the same way. And I feel like this is a huge issue with the YA genre, and I think it's part of the reason that when I was reading as a kid, like when I was like 12 or something, I basically like jumped over the YA genre to adult books because I didn't feel like there was anything in that genre for me. And I feel like if you've been watching my channel, you've seen that I've really gone back to YA, and that's partially because of this huge boost of queer literature that really focuses on friendships and family and community and support and all of those feelings that I was looking for in my narratives, but I couldn't find. Now that being said, just because like you're asexual doesn't mean that you can't read like smut and enjoy it. And just because you're aromantic doesn't mean that you might not necessarily enjoy reading romantic stories. And I do love romance. I enjoy reading it. It's something that I don't mind every once in a while, but for me, when that's like the main thing of the story, it doesn't pull me in as much because that's not what my life looks like, and that's not something that I want. And I think a lot of times the sexual like really overweighs those romantic feelings. Like I can't think of how many times I've read a book and characters are like commenting on like bulges or like skin that they can see that's showing, or like how their body feels when they're like super close to someone, and it just makes me feel kind of like uncomfortable reading it because I don't feel those things. And I'm also like, I consider myself sex neutral, but like it's not really something that I have any interest in engaging in. So to be reading about people with those feelings, I can't connect, I can't relate, like that doesn't make sense to me. And it's frustrating. It's so frustrating to not be able to find stories with ace characters. And when I find stories with ace characters, I actually like lose my mind because it means so much to me to be able to read something and be like, oh my god, this character feels the way that I feel, like I'm not the only one. And I think we don't always give media the credit that it deserves, because media shapes so much of the way that we experience the world, and it can change our perspectives on people for better or for worse. There's this term that's symbolic annihilation, and it essentially talks about the way that recognizing that media is a symbolic representation of something, but if you annihilate someone from that text, that has lasting repercussions on the way that those people are represented in real life. So for example, if you're always creating media that like portrays women as lesser and essentially annihilates them as having their own autonomy, then people are going to pick up on that message, and that might be something that becomes perpetuated in external society as well. And I think that's something that is really exhausting with books, and is something that I struggle with in fandom community as well. So I'm gonna switch gears here and talk about shipping a little bit, because I feel like that's a big part of like not only booktube community, but just fandom community in general. I never really shipped anyone until like last year, when I got really heavy into the like Wolfstar fandom. So that's Sirius Black and Remus Lupin. And I think it was just because like that wasn't really something that I related to, but then also all of a sudden I was immediately like hit with like all this sexual content, which is fine if that's what people want and that's what they want to create, but the problem is there's no other side to that a lot of the times. And I found that really hard with being a part of the Carry On Wayward Son fandom, because sometimes I go on Tumblr and I'm just hit with like straight porn, or people being like upset that they haven't like made out or given each other blowjobs, or all these really explicit things. And it's hard for me to like recognize like, yes, people can want that, and also why does their relationship have to have sex in it in order for it to be valid? And I think that's where I really struggle the most with fandom, is that they sometimes, not everyone, but sometimes they treat sex like a natural progression in a relationship, and if that's not something that's represented in the book, they take it upon themselves to be like, oh no, this is something that the characters would do, and this is how they would engage in those activities. It's hard. It's so hard to read these characters that I fall in love with, their friendships, their bonds, and their connections with, and then be bombarded with a saturation of media that represents them in a way that I can't relate to. And I think that's part of the reason that I honestly stay absent from fandom most of the time, is because I feel so isolated in it that it is exhausting to constantly be engaging in media that refuses to acknowledge your existence. Yeah, okay. So I think if you ever doubt that ace representation matters, just read some reviews on Loveless by Alice Oseman. So that is an asexual, aromantic coming-of-age story, and the number of people I know who bawled their eyes out when that book came out, because growing up they didn't have anything that helped them identify as who they were and help them come to terms with that. And I think that's the other thing too, where stories matter, because I didn't come to terms with what my sexuality was until I was 20 years old. That's fine, like there's nothing wrong with that, but the problem is I didn't have the vocabulary to identify how I was feeling. And because of that, I felt like I was missing out on all of these milestones, all these things that people around me were doing and that society told me that I should be engaging in, that I just didn't have a desire for. I think I kept myself so busy for so long that I didn't really have to think about it. And, you know, people would tease me that I didn't like romance books, or I didn't want to read, you know, the most explicit things or watch the most explicit shows, and I felt bad about it. So I think when I finally, like, started to, like, deal with the fact that I was asexual, there was so much shame, because it felt like I was cutting myself out of society in some way, because it didn't feel like there was a place for me in society. And I think that's something that I still really struggle with when reading, is there's so many characters that I love, but it's so hard to see people jump to that like extreme. Like I was just reading a book and I was trying to figure out if the characters were friends or they were more than friends, and then I had this aha moment where I was like, why am I assuming? Like, why can't we have really open, physically intimate relationships between friends without having them have to be sexual, without having them have to be something more? And this is specifically an issue with male relationships a lot of times in books. It's really hard to find close, intimate male friendships. And as someone who has a tendency to identify more with male characters, that's something that's really exhausting for me. And I think that's another issue that I have with fandom sometimes, is it's like, why do we always have to jump to shipping someone? Like, that's fine. That's fine that people want relationships, but you also need to recognize that sometimes just having them be friends is just as valid. I love Sherlock, and I love Sherlock and John's friendship, and I think that's another fandom that I don't engage in because I get exhausted by the oversaturation of sexual and romantic feelings that have to happen between them for some reason, because people are saying it's there in undertones, and in that show it very much is. You know, queer baiting is a whole other conversation, but it's hard to sometimes just be like, can't we just let this piece go? Can't I just have this little bit of media that is essentially a queer platonic relationship and just be able to enjoy that? And it's hard. It's hard because there's so many different aspects of representation and misrepresentation and underrepresentation that are going into that. I don't know. Yeah. I'm gonna try and wrap up this video now, but I think what I wanted to say was who we are and how we experience the world changes the way that we engage with literature. And for me, being asexual changes the way that I engage with literature. And there are books and stories that I can't engage with because of that. And there are times that, as much as I love reading, it makes me feel more alone because I can't find myself in the stories that I love. And that is a really difficult and heavy thing to have to deal with some days. And I think that's why today, which is International Asexuality Day, means so much to me, because it is just a day where I am being saturated with lovely ace people, lovely ace representation, and hopefully positive conversations about asexuality. And it feels so nice after feeling so invisible for so long to be able to see that representation. And I think I'm guilty somewhat for making myself invisible by shutting down some of those conversations because of narratives that I've heard in society where I don't feel like I'm queer enough, or I don't feel like I have a right to be talking about this, and I'm not gonna do that anymore. I think as much as I make those little jokes about my sexuality, like, those are gonna be something that's not going away. But also, if there's something in a book that makes me uncomfortable because of that, I'm not gonna hide from discussing it anymore, because it's something that's important to me and it's something that really matters for me. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know it was a lot. I feel like it got a lot heavier than I intended for it to get, but I just wanted to be open and honest with you guys, and I also think this is a conversation that doesn't get had on BookTube enough. So if there's just one person out there that having this conversation helps, then I've done what I set out to do, because I know it's hard when you feel like you're not seeing yourself anywhere and you feel like you're the only one. You're not the only one. I'm here. I see you. You are valid no matter what your sexuality is. If you're struggling to come to terms with it, if you're still questioning, if you change your label, it's all good. It's all the process, and it's all a journey. If you guys have thoughts on what it's like while reading What Asexual, or things that you learned from this video, questions you have, drop them down in the comment below. I'm more than happy to try and take some time to respond to those, because I love hearing from you all so much. And yes, we have another Webcomic Wednesday coming out tomorrow, which has some ace representation in it. And that video is a lot more uphearted because it's just me freaking out at the camera for an hour. So thank you for taking the time to listen. I know this is a bit of a longer video. I appreciate you all. Have a wonderful International Asexuality Day, or just a regular Tuesday, however you want to consider this. And I'll see you in the next video. Till then, stay kind, look out for yourself, and take care.